guys. Welcome to Pagan Happy Hour. Happy Friday, everyone. We made it to the end of the week. How are you all doing? So I have a really exciting show for you today. Today, we are going to be talking about witches' familiars, which has been a highly requested topic, and I've been meaning to cover it. So I'm so excited to share some research I have with you all, to tell you about witches' familiars, how you can get one of your own if you're interested in that. So it should be a really fun chat today. And if you are new here, welcome. I do Pagan Happy Hour every Friday at 5 Central. And this has been so fun checking in with you guys. I think we're on like our 33rd episode at this point. So it's been a really great routine, and I love chatting with you all every Friday. So if you are new here, how this is going to work is I do have a topic and some prepared stuff that I'm going to be sharing with you, but I'm going to be keeping an eye on the comments as we go. So if you do have any thoughts that you'd like to bring into the conversation, any questions for me, definitely type away, and I will hopefully be able to bring your thoughts and ideas into the conversation. Of course, if you want to make sure that I do see your question or comment and bring it in, the best way to do that is through super chats. That's how you can, donate $1 or so to this show. It pops up really big on my screen, so I'll be sure see it and bring your thoughts into the conversation. And of course, it's a great way to support the show. The other great way to support the show is by joining my Patreon, where you gain access to our Discord server, which is a group of fellow witches and pagans, and we share insights and have conversations about a variety of pagan and witchy and divination topics. So I have all those links down below. But I got my drink here. I hope you have a drink as well. I'm going to cue the music. And why don't you tell me in the comments where you're from and what you're drinking tonight? Let's see. Checking your comments here. I see we have a fellow Texan tuning in. I am tuning in from Dallas. Let's see. We have people chiming in from Milwaukee, Poland, Chile, Pennsylvania, Romania, Naples, Italy, wow, Memphis, Arizona, Seattle, UK, let's see, Canada, New Orleans, Michigan, California, and Chicago. Oh, I used to live in Chicago. I recently moved to Dallas. I was in Chicago for about 6 years, though. Had a good time. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for chiming in, and let's jump into it. So we're going to be talking about witches' familiars. So obviously this is going to be a very witchcraft themed pagan happy hour. And I did do a lot of research for you guys. So if you do keep a book of shadows or a grimoire, you might want to keep a pen or paper ready in case you want to take notes on some of the history behind familiars or how you can get one for yourself. But I think we first need to discuss what a witch's familiar is, because there's a lot of misconceptions, I think, especially online, where people think if you are a witch and you just happen to have a pet, that pet is automatically your witch's familiar. But it's much more deep and interesting and complex than that. So you can technically have a pet as your familiar, but there's a lot more to it than just that. And we're going to get into it. But starting with kind of where this concept comes from, the idea of the witch's familiar predominantly comes from Europe and is associated with the late medieval and the early modern period. And a lot of this is specifically coming from Britain, maybe a little France and Germany as well, but mostly we're talking about British traditional witchcraft in the medieval and early modern period, which is the time and the place where the vast majority of our understanding of witchcraft comes from. A lot of the visuals of witchcraft, the look, the wand, the hat, the style, that comes predominantly from British traditional witchcraft from this time period. A lot of the historic spells we have, the rituals we have, a lot of it really originates here. So the first thing to think about is if this is happening in like medieval times and a little bit later, all of this concept of the witch's familiar is happening within a Christianized world. So we're looking at things from a Christian cosmology or a Christian point of view. So quite a bit different than the pagan world. While yes, in paganism, of course, there were animal spirits in a lot of ways, those types of entities and spirits are quite a bit different than the idea of the witch's familiar that develops in a world that has already mostly converted to Christianity in Europe. So I see we have a comment here that's interesting from Thea asking if black cats are still thought to bring bad luck today. And yes, some people think black cats do bring bad luck, but that's a really good comment because it shows how some of these older concepts of witches' familiars has persisted through time. People were afraid of black cats because cats were one of the animals associated with the witch's familiar. And of course, over time, that led to a prejudice against black cats, though nowadays it's much sadder in a way. I read, and I'm not sure if this is 100% true, that black cats still do not get adopted as often as other cats at shelters, not because they're considered bad luck anymore, but because they don't show up well in photos and people want to take pics with their cats for social media. So that breaks my heart. So if you do have a chance to adopt a black cat, you should. Let's see. So with witches' familiars, we're talking mostly about European folklore in the medieval and the early modern period. So what familiars really are is they're not necessarily animals. They're more so a spirit or an entity of some kind, and they were believed to assist witches in their magic, in their different spell work and rituals. So they were really kind of an assistant to the witch, someone that they could, have to do their bidding. And according to different written records we have of the time, it stated that those claiming to have contact with familiar spirits would often describe them as manifesting as an animal. So some of the more common ones were cats, rats, dogs, ferrets, birds, sometimes even like pigs or toads and hares. Nowadays, I think we definitely think of cats and then maybe the hare or the toad, but there was kind of a wide array that these familiars could appear as, but they weren't actually the animal itself. They were a spiritual entity that was manifesting in an animal form. So let me know if that's a bit complicated or if I'm not explaining that super clearly. But another interesting thing is while the majority of accounts describe them as appearing in animal form, occasionally they were said to appear in human form, and that they didn't necessarily look ghost-like or faded or atmospheric or anything like that. They looked solid and 3D, just like someone who is physically there. And that's a characteristic you'll find in all records of familiar spirits. They really do look like the animal or the person. The whole idea of a familiar spirit looking like a person definitely gives me like a little bit like Skinwalker vibes. It's kind of creepy. I don't know about you guys, but when I was doing some reading about familiar spirits, there's definitely a spooky aspect to them. Definitely put my hair on edge a little bit as I was continuing to read about them. But, that's something to keep in mind. Usually it's going to appear as an animal and look completely 3D and realistic, but sometimes it was said to even appear as a human figure. We have a good comment here from Green Chaos saying, I read that originally familiars weren't a thing in witchcraft. They came about because of the witch trials as just another way to prosecute supposed witches, as if you had a pet, then that means you're a witch. I think yes and no. The concept of familiars did definitely kind of feed into the witch trials, and we'll get into Salem specifically and the familiars that are recorded as existing in the Salem witch trials. But also there was a lot of familiar spirits that weren't even associated with witches, which I think is really interesting. So we'll get to that in a second. But just to kind of finish up on what familiar spirits actually are, when a witch would have a familiar spirit, they were often kind of looked at as in a really affectionate way. And in the records, a lot of them had kind of nicknames or sweet kind of nicknames. So they were really thought of as like nice things in a lot of ways to the witches. They loved their familiar spirits. They wanted to take care of their familiar spirits. And that's kind of a reoccurring theme too, leaving offerings for them, for example. So there is a difference, though, between the witch's familiar and the cunning man's familiar. And this kind of goes into what that last comment was about the idea of, were witches' familiars just something that was brought upon, women during the witch trials? But interestingly, there's kind of a difference here between witches and the cunning folk. And these were kind of two subsets of magical practitioners in British traditional witchcraft in the early modern period. So, of course, you have the witch, which we're all familiar with, the old hag living in the end of town. And sometimes, they were called witches and they weren't even witches. They were just kind of ostracized members of the community. Now, they were viewed as malevolent, and their specific familiar spirits were viewed as demonic. But the cunning folk were another subset of magical practitioners from this time period. And they did a lot of the same stuff the witch did. They were healers. They helped the townsfolk find missing objects. So they were, all around, good people that you would go to if you needed help of some kind. But they were kind of sanctioned by the church. They weren't persecuted like the witches were. And part of this has to do with gender and class. So while witches historically tended to be more female overall, the cunning folk were traditionally male. And also the witches were often of a lower class, they were more impoverished, whereas cunning folk weren't necessarily as impoverished. So this is kind of a annoying division here, that just because the men who happened to be a little bit wealthier, even though they were practicing magic the same way the witch would be, the church allowed them to do so. So the cunning folk also had familiar spirits, but they were not viewed as demonic entities like the witch's familiar. They were viewed more like the fae. or the little folk. So they were mysterious spiritual entities, but they weren't necessarily viewed as demonic. And the cunning folk would use their familiar in a similar way that the witch would to assist in their magical tasks, such as healing, divination, helping the townsfolk with what they needed. And then the cunning folk, another way that they kind of got around this whole like practicing magic is bad situation is that they believed that their specific magic was to counteract the demonic witchcraft magic by the witches. So a lot of their magic was protection magic against witchcraft, or ways to deter a witch or banish a witch. But in reality, it's just two sets of magical practitioners, one being sanctioned by the church and one being viewed as demonic. And we do have another layer, which is on top of both of these subsets, because these two subsets that I talked about were called low magic. Up here, you have high magic, which was also condoned by the church. And those were the ceremonial magicians like John Dee, if you're familiar with him. He's a famous ceremonial magician from the court of Queen Elizabeth I. These were wealthy individuals, sometimes even monks, that mixed in their magical practice with Christianity. And they were allowed to perform magic, for the most part. So you kind of have to really think about magic and familiar spirits through this lens of class and gender and everything that was going on with the church at the time, because some were allowed, some were not allowed, some were demons, some were fairies. So there's really a lot more going on with familiar spirits than initially meets the eye. So I'm just checking your comments here as we move on to the next thing. Okay. So we talked a bit about, what familiars are and what they can do. A couple other things about that. There are some accounts of making a pact with a familiar so that that familiar would serve you for a certain amount of time. This is probably the origin of the idea of a witch making a pact with the devil. It probably comes from this practice with familiars. Not all familiars were kind of viewed in this, like, I make a pact with you and then you're going to serve me type vibe, but some were. Even when you look at fairy lore and fairy stories, this is also sometimes something that would occur where you would make a pact with the Fae or a member of the Fae to do your bidding for a certain amount of time. Let's see. And in most cases, the familiar spirit wasn't just like an animal that was with you at all times. And it was something you would conjure when you needed it for a specific purpose. So you'd conjure your familiar spirit and then ask it to do your bidding. Usually, again, this type of bidding was for either like healing practices, divination, or, could be finding different objects, finding people, finding water in the town. So a lot of really practical things too, that familiar spirits were used for. Let's see. Oh, and another thing about the magicians and the ceremonial magicians, they also kind of used familiars in a certain way. They would conjure them in their elaborate ceremonial magic rituals. Then they would lock the familiar spirit in a bottle, a spirit bottle, or in a ring, like a gemstone, or some type of container of some kind. And then they would sell these specific charms to people, and say that, if you buy this bottle from me, it has a familiar spirit in it and you can call on it to do whatever you want. And because, again, the ceremonial magicians were often male and of a higher class status, that was not viewed as demonic or witchcraft by the English Witchcraft Act of, I think, 1504 or something like that, or 1604. So they kind of got a pass, whereas the other witches did not get a pass in this regard for selling the familiar services. That would have been something that was not okay, and most witches didn't sell the services of their familiar. It was more for their own purposes. Let's see. Craig has a great comment here. I think the story of Rumpelstiltskin might be in there. And yes, I am of the belief that Rumpelstiltskin is a familiar spirit. Also, I think there are a few other ones. The Frog Prince. There's a few other like kind of folklore stories that involve spirits spontaneously appearing like that. So yeah, great comment. Let's see. Okay, just checking your comments there, and then we'll move on. So next I want to go over how you get one. Now, let me know in the comments if you are a practicing witch. Have you ever worked with a familiar spirit before? And what that experience has been like, because I'd love to know from you guys. I personally haven't really worked with familiar spirits in my own practice. Maybe it's something I'll get into later, who knows? But I did want to share with you how you can get one if you want one. Now, there's the historic way that witches got their familiars, and this is taken from records that were sometimes, written from the witch trials themselves, so under torture. So, of course, take everything from a grain of salt. Sometimes the witches just said how their familiar appeared and someone wrote it down. So we do actually have a lot of written records here about how certain witches got their familiar spirit. So again, these are from Britain, from the early modern period. And in general, there were kind of three main ways that the witch would get their familiar. The first way was that the familiar spirit would spontaneously appear for them as they were going through their day-to-day activities. So, if that happens to you, great, awesome. That's pretty easy, right? So there are many accounts in literature of that occurring. The second manner that witches would get their familiar spirits is if it was given or gifted to them by another witch. Sometimes people would gift their familiar spirit on their deathbed to their mentor or a relative, something like that. And thirdly, the familiar spirit would appear if the witch was experiencing some type of significant difficulty of some kind. Maybe they didn't have any money, or they were sick, they needed help of some kind, they were in danger, and the familiar spirit would appear and agree to help them. So those were the three historic ways that witches would gain their familiar spirit. Now, obviously, not all of us are going to be as lucky to have that particular experience happen to us. So I did want to share another way to get a familiar spirit that probably fits our modern lives a little bit more, if you're interested. So this is how to basically use a pet and to have your pet be your familiar spirit. And I'm taking this from Nigel Pearson's Treading the Mill, which is a great book. I have a couple books linked down below about traditional witchcraft if you're interested. But he has some instructions here on using a household pet as a familiar, which I wouldn't necessarily always recommend here. And this gets kind of weird and spooky, so I hope you're ready for this. So let me read you a little bit about how to do this. So he says the actual technique is simple, but requires a close bond and understanding between the witch and the fellow worker. The crafter obtains an animal at a very young age. Ideally, they should be there at the animal's birth. The creature should be consistently in the witch's company or as much as possible so that a great bond grows up between the witch and the spirit. Let's see, the closer and more intimate the connection, the greater the bond will be. Let's see, the animal should be fed small amounts of the witch's blood in its food, just a few drops each time, to better increase the magical bond between them. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. This is kind of extreme. Let's see. This is the origin story of the witches suckling their familiars. And this is true if you look at records of witch trials and witches and their familiars. Often there's this whole like suckling the familiar, which is kind of weird through an extra teat the witch has somewhere on their body. But obviously not many of us have that, or if any of us have that, if you do, let me know. That could be really interesting. So in general, we can't do that. Let's see. Sleeping and dreaming together is just as intimate a bond between witch and familiar as is between human partners, and is to be encouraged in this situation. When the time comes for the witch to ask the familiar to do something, this is the technique to be employed. Hold the animal's face gently in your two hands and gaze deeply into its eyes, holding the look for as long as possible. If the animal breaks contact after a second or two, you must begin again. Say a soft charm under your breath gently so that the animal is both soothed and you enter a light trance state. It is here that the test of your link to your familiar occurs. You must impress upon the mind of the animal directly what it is that you wish to do and retain the mind-to-mind link while you are doing it. This needs much practice, as with any work of magic, and success is not to be expected at the first attempt. Once the link is established and the animal understands what to do, the witch releases it and sends it off to do her bidding. The practitioner now follows the animal by the mind contact and sees and senses through those of the animal. This is similar to like astral travel or hag riding, where you're kind of sending your spirit or your fetch body, if you've done some reading on traditional witchcraft, out into the world, and that you can see through its eyes. Let's see. Okay. If a strong enough link has been established, this will occur naturally. However, it is more usual at this point for the witch to go deeper into trance or to fall asleep and follow the animal by dream or clairvoyance. This is one explanation for the phenomenon known as repercussion in the old folk tales, where the witch appearing to have the same wounds as the animal if the animal has been shot or attacked. The witch had actually been with the animal the whole time. So that's why if the animal was wounded, the witch herself would have the same wounds. Once the task is performed, the animal either naturally returns or is recalled by the witch, who then wakes or returns from the trance and rewards the familiar with their favorite food. So that's an example of how you could use an animal as a witch's familiar. Of course, I don't necessarily condone this practice. It's up to you. That's the great thing about witchcraft. No one's going to tell you what to do. You can do whatever you want. But it is kind of interesting to see how witches' familiars can be very different. Sometimes they're just a spiritual entity that manifests into an animal, or in this case, you kind of create a witch's familiar by establishing a close bond with an animal since its birth. So there's several different ways to interact with witches' familiars and different ways people have used witches' familiars over the years. So I see Jenna's asking me if I've done this with my cats. No, I have not turned one of my cats into my witch's familiar. But I mean, it is an interesting idea. I'm curious from you guys. Like, I want some of you to experiment here and report back to me to see how it goes. Both my cats were shelter cats, so I obviously wasn't there for their birth. You know, they were already a little bit old when I got them. So yeah, probably wouldn't have worked as well. Let's see. Just checking your comments here. Okay, so lastly, I wanted to talk a bit about Salem and familiars, because the majority of our research about familiars comes from the witch trials. And of course, we all know Salem, we're all familiar, but there are, interestingly, several accounts from Salem of witches' familiars. So Sarah Good, if you are familiar with Salem, you'll know her. She was said to have a yellow bird that suckled on a teat between her fingers. And then Ann Putnam was said to have seen Sarah Good's bird in her visions. And Tituba was also said to have seen strange animals, and that these strange animals apparently urged her to harm people. Of course, who knows if any of this is accurate? The majority of this testimony was suspect at best, you know. Also, interestingly, during the trials, one man was charged with encouraging a dog to attack someone by magical means. And then this specific dog was actually tried in a trial, convicted, and hanged. So clearly there was a huge amount of fear around witches' familiars in Salem. And I'm sure it wasn't just Salem, it was witches' familiars, you know, during the medieval and early modern period in Britain as well, that were greatly feared, or even the Spanish Inquisition. Now, familiars are also tied kind of to the witch's mark. And if you're familiar with the witch trials, you've heard of the witch's mark. It's kind of a horrible, like sexualized thing, like a way that these people could inspect the body of the witch to see if she had any of these markings. So this whole teat and like suckling the familiar at the teat is all from the witch's mark concept. So they were kind of looking for that. It's very invasive, very horrible when you think about it. So there's definitely a connection there between the witch's mark and the familiar spirit. Yes, I see Rachel here has a great comment about the film, The Witch. So in that film, there is a raven suckling from the mother's breast. And does that, you know, have anything to do with familiar spirits? Yes, so it's that same concept of the animal kind of seeking nourishment from the witch. And they kind of use that idea of suckling, though in this book, they were even saying like drops of blood could have been used as well. So yeah, that's definitely what they were portraying there with the movie The Witch. So, and of course, the raven, or ravens in general, have a lot of connection with magic, or even paganism. If we want to go really back in time, we have Hunan and Munin, the two ravens from the Norse god Odin. So ravens have always been tied with magic and mystery. So it makes sense that they would include maybe a raven or the idea of the witch's mark or a familiar spirit in the movie The Witch, which I highly recommend if you are into horror or into witchcraft. It's one of my favorite horror movies. So I think it really does give you a sense of how the witch trials, at least in in America, in Salem, could have happened, because you get an idea of the fear, that was occurring by being alone in this strange world. So the need to kind of lash out and find these demonic, women was really just kind of a reaction to try to assert some control in an inherently uncontrollable environment. But yeah, it's a really great movie. So that is Salem. And of course, I highly recommend looking into witch trial literature if you want to learn more about familiar spirits, because it is fascinating. And there's so much here that I'm not necessarily able to cover and go over today. I see another great comment here from Rachel saying that Robert Eggers, he's the director of that movie, actually used journals from that area for the dialogue. Yeah, I love him. He's such a great director, and I've seen everything he's done. Did he do The Lighthouse? That was also a really good one. But yeah, so next, let me know if you have any comments or questions. I'm probably going to sign off in 5 minutes. I have to end happy hour a little bit early because I have a dinner scheduled for this evening. And of course, if you did get anything out of this, if you did find this educational or interesting in any way, you're of course welcome to submit a super chat with your question, or to provide any type of donation, or to join the Patreon, as that does help ensure that I can keep on creating these pagan happy hours for you all. So other things too that are more modern manifestations of the witch's familiar. We mentioned Rumpelstiltskin, obviously, but the Golden Compass and his Dark Material series, that does have a similar idea of witches' familiars in the concept of the daemon. Oh, and I see Michelle has given me a donation. Thank you so much. Happy Friday, Michelle. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And also you see witches familiars in Sabrina, of course, both in the older version with the cat Salem, but even in the new Netflix version, I think her aunts have separate witches familiars. One of the aunts' witches familiars is spiders, which is a really cool idea. And then even in Harry Potter, you have the wizards being allowed to bring an owl or a cat or a toad, traditional animals of the witches' familiar. So definitely it was inspired by that concept. Green Chaos, thank you very much for the donation. There's a question here. Would you say there's a difference between a spirit animal and a familiar? Yes, I definitely would say that there is a difference, both in the method of how you get one and also what they're used for. For a spirit animal, you're not telling your spirit animal to go do something for you, right? You're not necessarily using it for your magical purposes. You have a spirit animal to provide you with wisdom and guidance. So very different there, but great question. And then Jessica, thank you very much for your donation, says, the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, was that at all accurate? I actually made an entire video about the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina and how historically accurate it is. So definitely check that out on my channel. So yes, they did pull a lot of inspiration from traditional witchcraft, from, pagan ideas and sources, but obviously because it's a Netflix show, a lot of it's exaggerated and played up. But yeah, there is a lot of fun stuff there, and it's great, if you know a lot about witchcraft and paganism, you can watch something like Sabrina and be like, oh, that's where they're getting that idea from. Oh, clearly this aspect was the inspiration. And you definitely see the idea of familiars throughout the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. And let's see. Oh, and Katrina, thank you so much for your donation. I really appreciate it. I really hope you all enjoyed this pagan happy hour this week. I do unfortunately have an announcement for next week. I'm going to be traveling, so I'm going to be on a plane next Friday. So I will not be able to do a pagan happy hour next Friday, but stay tuned for the following Friday where we will be celebrating midsummer. So I got a really big pagan happy hour plan for you then. Let me check my calendar. So that's going to be, I think, on the 18th. So mark your calendars for a midsummer version of pagan happy hour. So I will see you then. And I hope you all have a great weekend. Thank you so much for your support, for watching my channel, and I'll see you all later. Bye.